I had just finished my final round of chemotherapy on a Tuesday afternoon. My hands were still trembling from the meds, the sterile hospital scent still clinging to my shirt when I got the email, a meeting request for the next morning from the executive office. No subject line, no explanation, just a cold, clinical calendar invite that sent a chill deeper than anything the treatment had managed. The next day, I walked into the boardroom on the 31st floor, the same room where I had once negotiated million-dollar deals on behalf of Whitaker, Knox, the premier legal consultancy firm in Dallas, where I'd spent nearly half my life. But there were no handshakes this time, no nods of respect from colleagues who used to call me the client whisperer. At the head of the table sat Kyle Denham, the newly minted CEO who'd been with the company for less than a year, a young man with a corporate smile perfected in a mirror and eyes hidden behind thick designer glasses. "Evelyn," he began, voice flat, "today will be your final day at WK. We're restructuring client services. This is a strategic decision, nothing personal." I didn't speak. Each word landed like a nail being driven into the coffin of my career. 26 years of service, of sleepless nights managing crises, of showing up to boardrooms straight from the oncology wing dismissed, as if I were an outdated line item in an annual report. Across from me sat a woman from HR, carefully avoiding eye contact as she slid a manila folder toward me. Inside, 2 months severance and insurance coverage through the end of the quarter. I almost laughed. I had written that exact severance policy 10 years ago, back when WK still claimed to value people over spreadsheets. I steadied my breath. "Does Mr. Whitaker know about this?" I asked, referring to the founder, the man who had once called me the backbone of client loyalty. Kyle smiled. All senior leadership was consulted. A non-answer. I knew Whitaker was overseas, negotiating the firm's European expansion, and I knew that if he were here, he wouldn't have let them escort me out of the building like a criminal. Not after everything. I stood up. No one met my gaze. Not Kyle. Not HR, not the executive assistant I once mentored. They all looked down, as if even they knew this was wrong, but none were brave enough to say it. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and until a few minutes ago, I was the senior director of client relations at one of the most respected firms in the South. But now, I had been thrown out like expired policy paperwork because I was older, because I had been sick, and because I had stayed loyal too long. When I first walked through the glass doors of Whitaker, Knox in the spring of 1997, the office took up half a floor in a modest building on the outskirts of Dallas. We had fewer than 24 clients, 2 conference rooms with flickering fluorescent lights, and a copier that jammed every third page. But we had vision, and more importantly, we had trust. Trust in each other and in the idea that a firm could thrive not just by being smart, but by being human. Back then, Walter Whitaker was a fiery 40-something with rolled-up sleeves and the kind of intensity that made people believe in something bigger than billable hours. During my interview, he told me something I never forgot. "Evelyn, the numbers will always matter, but numbers are cold. People do business with people they trust." He hired me not because of where I'd worked, but because I understood that principle instinctively, and because I had spent my career not just closing deals, but building bridges that lasted. I wasn't chasing titles or corner offices. While others scrambled for credit on high-profile cases or networked their way into promotions, I quietly dedicated myself to learning every client's story. I knew which ones preferred face-to-face meetings and which responded best to concise emails. I tracked their company milestones, remembered the names of their spouses and children, sent handwritten notes when someone graduated or fell ill, and never missed a single renewal deadline. To some, that might have seemed like old-fashioned courtesy, but to me, it was the difference between being useful and being irreplaceable. By the time I celebrated my 20th anniversary, Walter stood at the podium during the company banquet and called me the architect of our client loyalty. He said I had built the foundation of what kept our firm standing through economic crashes, mergers, and every storm in between. I still remember the gift he handed me, that Nida crystal paperweight etched with the words "built on trust." I kept it on my desk every day since, right up until security hovered beside me waiting for me to pack. But over the years, something began to shift. 2 years ago, the firm brought in outside investors to accelerate expansion, and with them came a different breed of leadership, people who viewed relationships as data points and clients as line items to be optimized. I began to notice subtle changes. New executives who didn't ask for background on long-standing clients, junior analysts who believed a CRM system could replace 2 decades of rapport, and a growing obsession with scalability that pushed empathy out the door. The turning point came when Kyle Denham arrived. Armed with credentials and confidence, he spoke of modernization in ways that made my skin crawl. He praised automation, questioned legacy practices, and, without ever saying it out loud, made it clear that experience was now considered baggage. I tried to raise concerns during leadership meetings, warning that our client retention was beginning to slip and that the heart of our business wasn't our systems but the people who trusted us with their problems. But my voice, once respected, began to fade into the background. Invitations to meetings stopped arriving. Strategic memos no longer included my name. Projects I had nurtured were quietly handed off to younger, faster, cheaper. Still, I stayed the course. I believed that what I had built mattered, that even in this new landscape of analytics and efficiency metrics, genuine human connection would prevail. I managed the portfolios of clients who made up nearly 65% of our annual revenue. Just one of them, Crescent Bay Medical, brought in over $5 million a year, and their CEO had stated, in no uncertain terms, that she wouldn't renew her contract unless I remained their point of contact. But apparently, none of that was enough to outweigh my age, my salary, or my recent downtime due to illness. I overheard Kyle one evening while passing the executive suite, speaking in hushed tones but just loud enough to catch the words, "This restructuring gives us a chance to trim some of the legacy weight. Their health benefits alone will cost us a fortune." That night, I sat alone in my car, parked in the lot I had pulled into 5 days a week for over 2 decades, staring at the lights of the building I had helped grow from a scrappy startup into a respected powerhouse. For the first time in my career, I wondered if I had stayed too long, believing that loyalty was still a currency in corporate America. And yet, despite everything, the exclusion, the whispers, the boardroom blinds drawn tighter every month, I didn't walk away. I still believed in what we had once stood for. I still believed that someone, somewhere in that glass tower, would remember that this firm wasn't built by spreadsheets and strategy decks, but by people like me who gave more than their hours, who gave their hearts. But I was wrong, and by the time I realized it, the decision had already been made. It wasn't the severance package that hurt, not really. 2 months of pay and temporary benefits were, in corporate terms, considered generous. What cut deeper was the manner in which it happened, the way I was ushered out of Whitaker Knox like a risk to be mitigated, not a woman who had poured over 2 decades of her life into building something meaningful. I had often believed that if I ever left, it would be with a farewell luncheon, perhaps a plaque, maybe even a few words of gratitude, but instead, I was handed a beige envelope and a weak smile while a security guard stood awkwardly by the door, avoiding my eyes. As I packed up my office, my name still etched on the frosted glass door, I took each item as if it were a fragment of a life that someone else had lived. The framed photo with Crescent Bay Medical's executive team at last year's charity gala, the thank you card from the Yates family after we helped save their multi-generational business, and the heavy crystal paperweight Walter Whitaker had given me on my 20th anniversary, back when people still said things like, "You're the heart of this firm." The same heart they had now decided was too expensive, too slow, or maybe just too human for the direction they were heading. As I was sealing the final box, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire Baldwin, the CEO of Crescent Bay. "Heard unsettling things about WK. Call me." My stomach twisted. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even processed it myself, but already the ripples had begun. I glanced through the glass to see Kyle Denham in his corner office. Phone pressed to his ear, voice animated, no doubt spinning the story, preparing for damage control. What he didn't realize, or maybe refused to understand, was that client relationships weren't commodities that could be shuffled like files or transferred with a login. They were earned, nurtured, and defended, often in quiet, invisible ways, over dinners, late-night phone calls, and years of trust built word by word, action by action. He thought this was just another chess move in a restructuring strategy. He didn't know he had just knocked over the queen. That night, alone in my apartment, surrounded by job boards I hadn't looked at in years and half-hearted messages from colleagues Too scared to say what they really felt, I let the weight of it all settle in. There was no more office to return to, no daily rhythm of client check-ins or project briefings, no sense of purpose anchored to a place I once considered home. And the timing. Coming so soon after finishing treatment when my body was still rebuilding and my spirit only beginning to trust itself again made it feel all the more cruel. My LinkedIn notifications were blowing up. It was the digital equivalent of whispers in the hallway. People suddenly remembered my name. Connections I hadn't spoken to in years were sending polite messages, thinly veiled as support, but clearly fishing for details. I didn't reply to any of them. Then came the phone call I hadn't expected. "Evelyn, it's Walter," came the familiar voice, slightly strained with fatigue and disbelief. "I just landed from London and heard what happened. I didn't approve this. None of it." The conflicting emotions hit like a wave. Relief that the man who had once mentored me hadn't signed off on my termination, anger that he hadn't been there to stop it, and a simmering sense of betrayal that no one had even tried to fight for me. "It's done, Walter," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. Kyle said all senior partners were consulted. "I was sidelined," he said, his voice hardening. "They waited until I was overseas and pushed it through under some bogus emergency clause. Said it was critical for quarterly optics before the investor presentation." "After 26 years, I said, not raising my voice but pressing each word with intention, "I got 10 minutes in a conference room and a security escort." "You deserve so much better," he replied. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. Then he made an offer, a chance to come back, to frame it all as a misunderstanding, to pretend none of it had happened. But what he didn't seem to understand, and what I had come to realize, the moment that envelope hit the table, was that this wasn't just a mistake. It was a declaration. I had been labeled legacy weight, a relic of the past they no longer had use for. That phrase wasn't just a throwaway line I'd overheard, it was a verdict. When he told me Claire Baldwin's account had been reassigned to a junior partner, someone Claire had once called abrasive and tone-deaf, I couldn't help but laugh, a dry, exhausted sound. "Good luck with that," I said, but I hadn't made any calls. I hadn't complained, or ranted, or tried to rally anyone to my defense. I was too tired for vengeance. And yet, somehow, word had already spread. One by one, the people I'd built years of trust with were calling, texting, asking what had happened and where I was going next. I didn't know it yet, but the storm had already begun, quiet, unseen, gathering behind boardroom doors and investor updates, and I wasn't the one stirring it, but I would be the one standing when it hit. 3 days after I was let go, I was still waking up at 6, 15 out of habit, still reaching for a notebook that no longer needed my notes, and still checking my email, half expecting project updates that would never come. The silence that filled my apartment wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that presses down on your chest and makes you question your worth. My body was healing from months of chemo, my energy still unpredictable, but what stung worse than any needle was the feeling of having been discarded at the exact moment I thought I'd finally made it back. I spent those early days not plotting revenge or rehearsing comebacks, but simply trying to remember who I was without a company badge clipped to my blouse. I updated my resume for the first time in years, rewrote my LinkedIn summary 3 times, then deleted it altogether, unsure of how to explain a career that ended not with a farewell, but with a quiet, humiliating dismissal. I stared at my bookshelf, at all the leadership books I had once believed in, wondering if they had been written for someone younger, healthier, more marketable. Then, one morning, as I was sipping the weak coffee I'd brewed without much interest, the landline rang a rarity these days. The caller ID made my heart skip. Claire Baldwin, CEO of Crescent Bay Medical. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, perhaps the same stubbornness that had pulled me through radiation when my doctors were quietly pessimistic, made me pick up. "Tell me you're not really gone," Claire said without preamble, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Please tell me this is a temporary thing." "I'm afraid it's not," I said, steadying my voice. The firm made its choice. Restructuring, they called it. "Restructuring, my foot," she snapped. "That girl Madeline something called me yesterday to introduce herself as my new relationship manager. She talked to me like I'd never signed a deal in my life." I could almost picture Claire pacing her office, red pen in hand, scribbling margin notes while venting into the phone. I smiled softly, the kind of smile that holds both sadness and validation. I'm sure she meant well. Don't feed me the diplomatic line, Evelyn, she said flatly. We've known each other too long for that. Where are you going next? I hesitated, not because I didn't have options, but because I hadn't yet decided what those options meant. Nowhere yet, I said, but I'm exploring. Well, explore quickly. Our contract is up for renewal in 8 weeks. If you're elsewhere by then, I'd like to follow. It wasn't just a kind gesture. It was a life-linear quiet signal that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't lost everything. And it wasn't the last. That evening, I received a call from Gabriel Thomas of Midstate Biotech, then from the executive director of Horizon Trust, and then 3 more names I hadn't expected to hear again so soon. By nightfall, I had 11 inquiries, each one expressing not just surprise or sympathy but interest. The next morning, I met with Catherine Ellis, the headhunter who had placed some of the highest paid executives in the consulting world. She handed me a thick envelope at a quiet cafe in Westwood, her expression unreadable but her tone direct. 3 firms want to meet you. 2 are willing to build a role around you. And 1 just doubled your old salary before even asking how many clients might come with you. I blinked, scanning numbers that seemed unreal, especially given I'd just been labeled too expensive to keep. Catherine leaned in slightly and said, "They're not just paying for your expertise, Evelyn. They're paying for your name, your network, and your reputation, which, by the way, is burning through boardrooms across this city right now." I laughed not out of arrogance, but because the irony was almost poetic. At Whitaker, Knox, I'd been seen as a call center. Out here, I was an asset with a market value that shocked even me. I didn't jump at the first offer. I let them court me, not out of vanity, but because for once, I had the power to choose a knot based on desperation or survival, but on alignment. I found myself leaning toward a mid-sized firm called Eastbridge Consulting, small enough to value people, big enough to matter, and, most importantly, still grounded in the kind of client-first culture that used to mean something. Meanwhile, the situation at WK was unraveling faster than I could have anticipated. My former assistant, Molly, still loyal despite the risk, began texting me quiet updates. Clients were agitated. Claire had demanded a face-to-face with the executive board. Several firms were reviewing contracts. Even legacy clients, the ones who'd been with the firm since the fax machine days, were reportedly shopping around. I hadn't made a single phone call to encourage it. I didn't need to. Clients talk, especially the ones who sit on boards together, share panels, and exchange stories over cocktails at industry events. And when trust is broken, when the human connection is severed, they don't ask for status reports. They leave. The final sign that things were shifting came not in the form of an email or a phone call, but a news tip. Jeffrey Hahn, a journalist with the Dallas Ledger, reached out asking for comment. Sources say 7 of the firm's top clients have signaled intent to walk, he said. Many are linking their departure to your absence. Would you care to respond? I didn't, not officially. I thanked him, declined to comment, and hung up with my hands slightly trembling. Not from fear, but from the gravity of it all. What had been done quietly in a corner office had now grown into a ripple spreading across the industry. The boardroom doors were shaking, and for the first time since I'd been cut loose, I didn't feel discarded. I felt dangerous. The call came at 7:42 on a Thursday morning. Just as I was reviewing Eastbridge's formal offer, it was Walter. I could hear the tension in his voice before he even said my name. "Evelyn," he said, breath short. "We need to meet. In person. Today." There was a time when a request like that from him would have prompted me to cancel everything, rearrange my schedule, and make time out of thin air. But that version of me belonged to a chapter that had been closed abruptly and without ceremony. "I don't think that would be appropriate," I replied, not unkindly, but with the calm detachment of someone who had learned not to confuse history with loyalty. "Then lunch," he insisted, his voice tightening. "The Drake, 1 o'clock. There are things you need to know." Curiosity won out. I arrived at precisely 1, walking into the oak-paneled dining room of the Drake, with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to impress anyone. Walter was already there, looking older than I remembered. His expression strained in a way that years of late flights and early board meetings had never etched into his face. "I've been trying to fix this," he said, skipping pleasantries. "But Kyle's blocking me at every turn. He's convinced the board that your termination was necessary, part of some grand plan to modernize our structure." I listened without interrupting, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I hadn't touched. "And the clients?" I asked finally. He sighed, leaning forward. "They're leaving or threatening to. Claire Baldwin demanded a full executive review. 2 legacy accounts are in open talks with competitors. 3 mid-tier clients have already sent notice. And there are rumors that more are on the edge." I nodded slowly, not in glee, but with the solemn understanding that this was inevitable. "That's what happens," I said gently, "when you treat relationships like assets on a balance sheet." He didn't argue. Instead, he offered me something I hadn't expected: control. "I want to bring you back, Evelyn. Not just as a gesture. As Chief Client Officer, you'll report directly to me. Full autonomy, higher compensation. We need you." It would have been a dream offer a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago. But now, it felt like a plea made far too late. I studied his fascinate for the words he spoke, but for the fear behind them. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked. He hesitated, and then, in a moment of rare vulnerability, admitted the truth. "Kyle is consolidating power. He's positioning himself to force me out. If the client situation deteriorates further, he'll have the leverage he needs. This isn't just about saving the firm. It's about saving what's left of what I built." That was the moment it all crystallized. I wasn't being asked back because my value had been rediscovered. I was being offered as a lifeline, a final card to be played in someone else's battle for survival. "I'm sorry, Walter," I said, setting down my cup, "but I already have meetings lined up with people who see my worth without waiting for the ship to start sinking." He nodded, trying not to show how deeply the words cut, but I could see it. "It's just business, right?" I added, echoing the line Kyle had delivered to me in that cold, sterile boardroom. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, offers, and quiet momentum. Eastbridge moved quickly, and by the following Tuesday, I had accepted their proposal for partnership, equity, and the ability to build a client-first division from scratch. But I didn't stop there. I asked for one condition before signing: that they pursue a strategic acquisition of Whitaker, Knox. To my surprise, they were already exploring it. The firm's instability, the client exodus, and the growing unrest among stakeholders had attracted attention from more than just competitors. It had drawn the eye of Horizon Capital, a private equity group with deep roots and little patience for leadership missteps. By the time Walter called again, things had shifted beyond his control. "Did you organize this?" he asked, not angrily, but with the quiet panic of a man watching the tide roll in too fast. "Clients are leaving. The board's in chaos. 70% of our client base has either walked or issued ultimatums, and now there's talk of replacing Kyle before the next board meeting." "I didn't organize anything, Walter," I said honestly, but maybe they realized what really mattered before it was too late. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that says more than any argument. "Come back," he said finally, "not as a gesture, as a full equity partner. Help me write this." I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel every ounce of this moment. For years, I had been the quiet constant, the person who smoothed the rough edges and asked for nothing but the chance to do good work. Now, I was the variable they hadn't accounted for. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," I said. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker like unspoken truths, weighing the comfort of legacy against the promise of a new chapter. Returning would mean walking back into the same halls where silence had followed my exit. It would mean managing the cleanup of a culture that had already betrayed its own heart. And yet, those clients, those relationships, they weren't numbers to me. They were people I had stood by for decades. By dawn, I had made my decision. At 8:45 the next morning, I stepped through the glass doors of Whitaker, Knox, for the first time since I was escorted out. The receptionist looked stunned. "Ms. Brooks, are you here for the all hands?" "I am," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Walter is expecting me." The boardroom was packed, executives flown in from across the country. Junior staff pressed against the walls, tension hanging in the air like static. Walter stood at the head of the table, flanked by two board members. Kyle was conspicuously absent. "Thank you all for coming," Walter began, his voice steadier than I expected. "As many of you know, we've been navigating serious client concerns following recent leadership decisions. I'm pleased to announce that Evelyn Brooks has agreed to return as a full equity partner to lead our new client trust division." There were murmurs, relief, surprise, maybe even hope. Then I stepped forward. "Thank you, Walter," I began, then paused. "But I need to clarify something. I won't be returning to Whitaker Knox." The silence hit hard. Instead, I've accepted a partnership at Eastbridge Consulting. And as of this morning, Eastbridge, in coordination with Horizon Capital, has completed negotiations to acquire a controlling stake in Whitaker Knox. The room erupted. Walter looked stunned. "Evelyn, what have you done?" I met his gaze without malice. "Nothing personal, Walter. Just business." The article appeared in the Texas Business Review the next morning. A clean, clipped headline read, "Eastbridge acquires Whitaker, Knox after client exodus." The body of the piece was as clinical as it was brief, full of passive phrasing and polite corporate euphemisms, leadership changes, stakeholder realignments, unexpected executive transitions, all carefully crafted to shield bruised reputations. My name appeared once, buried 3/4 down the page. Evelyn Brooks, former Senior Director of Client Relations, will oversee the integration of key accounts as a full partner at Eastbridge Consulting. But behind those few words lay the true story, that I had gone from being escorted out of my own office like a liability to becoming the architect of one of the most consequential power shifts in the firm's history, not by force, not by scandal, but by simply knowing my worth and refusing to let others decide it for me. The transition happened faster than most thought possible. Within weeks, I was seated in a new office on the 19th floor of Eastbridge's Dallas headquarters, overlooking the same skyline I had once viewed from a much colder place. But the air here felt different. There was purpose, clarity, and a quiet confidence in every corner. Not because I had something to prove, but because I no longer needed anyone's permission to lead. The integration process began immediately. I spent long hours reviewing client histories, meeting with transition teams, and carefully managing the delicate emotions of those still at Whitaker Knox who hadn't left or been pushed out. Some came to me cautiously, others with open relief, people who had once looked the other way as I was shown the door, now standing in front of me, asking what came next and whether they still had a place. I didn't gloat and I didn't lecture. I simply looked them in the eye and said, "Do the work, be better, it starts now." Walter asked to meet a week after the acquisition was announced. When he entered the conference room, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 days. He sat across from me with the quiet resignation of someone who understood, perhaps too late, that he had allowed something precious to erode on his watch. "You orchestrated this," he said, not as an accusation, but as a confession of his own failure. "No," I replied, my voice even. "I recognize value where others didn't. That's all." He nodded slowly, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I slid a folder across the table. "Eastbridge is offering you a 3-year consulting role advisory only. No management responsibilities. It's generous, Walter, considering the circumstances." He opened it without a word, scanned the page, and closed it again. "And if I decline, then you walk away with your equity payout, and someone else helps us finish what we've started." He didn't argue. As the weeks passed, the dust settled. Clients who had left returned quietly. The 3 that had walked during the initial upheaval were back by the end of the quarter. Revenue stabilized, then rose. Employee turnover dropped. Trust, it turned out, was a better currency than efficiency. And Kyle? He landed at a much smaller firm in Denver without legacy accounts, without goodwill, and without the patience for his kind of ambition. I didn't follow his career, but I heard whispers through the industry that he was having a hard time regaining credibility. Not because I had smeared his name, I hadn't spoken a single word against him, but because the fallout spoke for itself. 6 months later, I stood in the newly combined Eastbridge Whitaker conference room, now simply branded Eastbridge Trust Division, and reviewed our client retention metrics. 96% had stayed. Of the 4% who left, 2 had already expressed interest in returning. As I walked down the hallway, past former colleagues who now greeted me with respect rather than rehearsed small talk, I felt something I hadn't in years. Alignment, not with a company, but with myself. For too long, I had defined my worth by what I could do for others by, how useful I was to a system that ultimately saw me as replaceable. But now, every meeting, every decision, every hand I shook was grounded in something deeper than strategy. It was grounded in self-respect. Claire Baldwin met me for lunch the following week, dressed in her signature navy blazer, her smile as sharp as ever. She raised her glass before we ordered and said, "To the most elegant power shift this industry's seen in decades." I smiled back. "It wasn't a power shift, Claire. It was a course correction." She laughed. "Call it whatever you want." You reminded them all that people, not processes, are what hold companies together. And as we talked, not about contracts or quarterly goals, but about legacy, mentorship, and how to build something that lasts, I realized I hadn't come out of this just vindicated. I had come out transformed. I never sought revenge. I never needed to. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or fury. It arrives quietly, with a phone call, an offer, or the soft sound of your own voice saying, "No, I deserve better." And this time, the world answered back, "Yes, you do." If this story moved you, if you've ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or told you were no longer valuable, know this: your worth doesn't expire, your strength doesn't fade, and your time, it's never too late.